Sensation. The process by which stimulation of a sensory receptor produces neural impulses that the brain interprets as a sound, a visual image, an odor, a taste, a pain, or other sensory image. Sensation represents the first series of steps in processing of incoming information. Perception. A process that makes sensory patterns meaningful. It is perception that makes these words meaningful, rather than just a string of visual patterns. To make this happen, perception draws heavily on memory, motivation, emotion, and other psychological processes. Transduction. Transformation of one form of energy into another, especially the transformation of stimulus information into nerve signals by the sense organs. Without transduction, ripe tomatoes would not appear red. Sensory adaptation. Loss of responsiveness in receptor cells after stimulation has remained unchanged for a while, as when a swimmer becomes adapted to the temperature of the water. Absolute threshold. The amount of stimulation necessary for a stimulus to be detected. In practice, this means that the presence or absence of a stimulus is detected correctly half the time over many trials. Difference threshold. The smallest amount by which a stimulus can be changed and the difference be detected half the time. Just noticeable difference. Same as the difference threshold. Signal detection theory explains how we detect signals, consisting of stimulation affecting our eyes, ears, nose, skin, and other sense organs. Signal detection theory says that sensation is a judgment the sensory system makes about incoming stimulation. Often, it occurs outside of consciousness, in contrast to older theories from psychophysics. Signal detection theory takes observer characteristics into account. Retina. The thin light-sensitive layer at the back of the eyeball, the retina, contains millions of photoreceptors and other nerve cells. Photoreceptors. Light-sensitive cells in the retina that convert light energy to neural impulses. The photoreceptors are as far as light gets into the visual system. Rods. Photoreceptors in the retina that are especially sensitive to dim light but not to colors. Strange as it may seem, they are rod-shaped. Cones. Photoreceptors in the retina that are especially sensitive to colors but not to dim light. They are cone-shaped. Optic nerve. The bundle of neurons that carries visual information from the retina to the brain. Blind spot. The point where the optic nerve exits the eye and where there are no photoreceptors. Any stimulus that falls on this area cannot be seen. Brightness. A psychological sensation caused by the intensity of light waves. Color. Also called hue, not a property of things in the external world, rather, it is a psychological sensation created in the brain from information obtained by the eyes from the wavelengths of visible light. Electromagnetic spectrum. The entire range of electromagnetic energy, including radio waves, X-rays, microwaves, and visible light. Visible spectrum. The tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum to which our eyes are sensitive. The visible spectrum of other creatures may be slightly different from our own. Trichromatic theory. The idea that colors are sensed by three different types of cones sensitive to light in the red, blue, and green wavelengths. The trichromatic theory explains the earliest stage of color sensation. Opponent process theory. The idea that cells in the visual system process colors in complementary pairs, such as red or green, or as yellow or blue. The opponent process theory explains color sensation from the bipolar cells onward in the visual system. After images. Sensations that linger after the stimulus is removed. Most visual after images are negative after images, which appear in reversed colors. Color blindness. Typically a genetic disorder that prevents an individual from discriminating certain colors. The most common form is red-green color blindness. Frequency. The number of cycles completed by a wave in a given amount of time, usually a second. Amplitude. The physical strength of a wave. This is usually measured from peak to valley on a graph of the wave. Tympanic membrane. The eardrum. Cochlea. The primary organ of hearing, a coiled tube in the inner ear, where sound waves are transduced into nerve messages. Basilar membrane. A thin strop of tissue sensitive to vibrations in the cochlea. The basilar membrane contains hair, Cells connected to neurons. When a sound wave causes the hair cells to vibrate, the associated neurons become excited. As a result, the sound waves are converted into nerve activity. Pitch. A sensory characteristic of sound produced by the frequency of the sound wave. Loudness. A sensory characteristic of sound produced by the amplitude of the sound wave. Timbre. The quality of a sound wave that derives from the wave's complexity. Timbre comes from the Greek word for drum, as does the term tympanic membrane, her eardrum. Vestibular sense. The sense of body orientation with respect to gravity. The vestibular sense is closely associated with the inner ear and, in fact, is carried to the brain on a branch of auditory nerve. Kinesthetic sense. The sense of body position and movement of body parts relative to each other. Olfaction. The sense of smell. Pheromones. Chemical signals released by organisms to communicate it with other members of their species. Pheromones are often used by animals as sexual attractants. It is unclear whether or not humans employ pheromones. Gustation. The sense of taste from the same word root as gusto, also called the gustatory sense. Skin senses. Sensory systems for processing touch, warmth, cold, texture, and pain. Gate control theory. An explanation for pain control that proposes we have a neural gate that can, under some
circumstances, block incoming pain signals. Placebo effect.
A response to a placebo, caused by subjects' belief that they are taking real drugs. Percept. The meaningful product of perception, often an image that has been associated with concepts, memories of events, emotions, and motives. Feature detectors. Cells in the cortex that specialize in extracting certain features of a stimulus. Binding problem. Refers to the process used by the brain to combine the results of many sensory operations into a single percept. This occurs, for example, when sensations of color, shape, boundary, and texture are combined to produce the percept of a person's face. No one knows exactly how the brain does this. Thus, the binding problems is one of the major unsolved mysteries in psychology. Bottom-up processing. Perceptual analysis that emphasizes characteristics of the stimulus rather than our concepts and expectations. Bottom refers to the stimulus, which occurs at step 1 of perceptual processing. Top-down processing. Perceptual analysis that emphasizes the perceiver's expectations, concept memories, and other cognitive factors, rather than being driven by the characteristics of the stimulus. Top refers to a mental set in the brain, which stands at the top of the perceptual processing system. Perceptual constancy. The ability to recognize the same object as remaining constant under different conditions, such as changes in illuminations, distance, or location. Illusion. You have experienced an illusion when you have a demonstrably incorrect perception of a stimulus pattern, especially one which also fools others who are observing the same stimulus. Ambiguous figures. Images that are capable of more than one interpretation. There is no right way to see an ambiguous figure. Gestalt psychology. From a German word that means whole, or form, or configuration, the Gestalt psychologists believed that much of perception is shaped by innate factors built into the brain. Figure. The part of a pattern that commands attention. The figure stands out against the ground. Ground. The part of a pattern that does not command attention. The background. Closure. The Gestalt principle that identifies the tendency to fill in gaps in figures and to see incomplete figures as complete. Laws of perceptual grouping. The Gestalt principles of similarity, proximity, continuity, and common fate. These laws suggest how our brains prefer to group stimulus elements together to form a percept. Law of similarity. The Gestalt principle that we tend to group similar objects together in our perceptions. Law of proximity. The Gestalt principle that we tend to group objects together when they are near each other. Law of continuity. The Gestalt principle that we prefer perceptions of connected and continuous figures to disconnected and disjointed ones. Law of common fate. the Gestalt principle that we tend to group similar objects together that share a common motion or destination. Law of Proganz. The most general Gestalt principle, which states that the simplest organization, requiring the least cognitive effort, will emerge as the figure. Proganz shares a common root with pregnant, and so it carries the idea of a fully developed figure. Binocular cues. Information taken in by both eyes that aids in depth perception, including binocular convergence and retinal disparity. Monocular cues. Information about depth that relies on the input of just one eye, includes relative size, light and shadow, interposition, relative motion, and atmospheric perspective. Learning-based inference. The view that perception is primarily shaped by learning, rather than by innate factors. Perceptual set. Readiness to detect a particular stimulus in a given context, as when a person who is afraid interprets an unfamiliar sound in the night as a threat. Describe the difference between absolute threshold and difference threshold. An absolute threshold refers to the minimum amount of one stimulus necessary for detection to occur, whereas a difference threshold refers to the smallest amount of difference between two or more stimuli necessary for a person to be able to discriminate one stimulus from another. Describe how top-down processing and bottom-up processing differ. Top-down uses previously acquired knowledge and experience to assist us in recognizing environmental stimuli, whereas bottom-up uses the physical energies that enter the body from the environment. Why are taste and smell referred to as chemical senses? Both senses involve responses to specific chemicals such as those in odorants and in food. How is the consistency of food communicated to the brain? Touch receptors located on the tongue relay textural information such as slimy to the brain. Identify an age-related disease that produces a diminished sense of smell. What does this relationship between disease and smell indicate about brain structures? Alzheimer's disease and the related loss of smell may indicate that the neurons in brain structures located in olfactory brain regions are deteriorating. Describe the pathway whereby touch receptors send information to the brain. Tactile information is sent via the spinal cord to the brain, where it is first received by the thalamus before being routed to the somatosensory cortex. Describe the characteristics of the slow and fast pain pathways. Fast pain pathways use myelinated neurons, whereas the slow pain pathways do not. Pain perceived through the fast pathways is sharp pain, whereas pain perceived through the slow pathways is nagging or burning pain. Describe the gate control theory. Some neural patterns of activity in the brain itself can create a gate to prevent pain messages from reaching the brain. Define phantom limb sensations. Tactile hallucinations. People with amputated limbs report sensations from. Mickey Mouse has a high-pitched voice. What does this mean in terms of frequency? The frequency of a sound wave refers to the number of cycles the wave completes in a certain amount of time. High-pitched sounds indicate that a great number of cycles are completed in a short period of time. Describe the place theory of audition. Differences in sound frequency activate different regions of the basilar membrane. Describe the cocktail party effect. The brain is able to filter out irrelevant noises in a loud environment so that we can focus attention on meaningful conversations around us. Define synesthesia and provide an example. Sleep disorder in which people receive sensations in a different modality than that of the original stimulus. Tasting light is an example. Describe 3 common causes of deafness. Infections, physical trauma, overdose of common medications, genetics, prolonged exposure to loud noises, etc. Describe the difference in the type of stimuli rods and cones are used to perceive. Rods are used to detect light and are useful in night vision. Cones are used to detect color and fine details. Explain the trichromatic theory of vision. There are 3 different sensors for color that respond to different wavelengths of light. How do Gestalt principles inform theories of vision? Helps add meaning to visual information. Laws of grouping and figure ground help identify how visual information is organized into coherent images. What is the difference between monocular and binocular depth cues? Binocular depth cues require the use of both eyes, whereas monocular cues require the use of only one eye. Name 3 diseases that can produce blindness. Diabetes, glaucoma, macular degeneration, etc. Describe the illusion of the Ames room. The Ames room is trapezoidal in shape and has sloped floors and ceilings. A person looks inside through a peephole using one eye so that the room appears normal, because the observer assumes both people are equidistant from him. He perceives the two people to be very different in size. What sensory process describes why the continual presence of a stimulus results in a decreased response to that stimulus over time? What type of perceptual processing begins with physical bottom-up? Given that the human visual system has natural limitations on our sense of vision, how have astronomers been able to see objects that are very far away? The invention of telescopes has allowed scientists to view faraway objects. What sense is most closely tied to taste? Smell. Hot or spicy foods activate what component of the tongue that communicates pain? Tactile system. What structure that is activated by the olfactory bulb is associated with regulation of emotions and fear? Amygdala. Many people report that smells are evocative of past events. What 2 structures in the brain may be activated during these olfactory trips down memory lane? Hippocampus and amygdala. Why may a person develop the disorder of ageusia, the loss of the ability to taste? Head trauma or oral surgery? Brandon has a cold and cannot smell his mother's delicious chocolate chip cookies that are baking in the oven. Describe the biological explanation for Brandon's impaired sense of smell. The increased mucus provided by the cold is blocking the olfactory receptors located on the cilia in Brandon's nose. What term describes how tactile information on one side of the body is processed on the opposite side of the brain? Contralaterally. What tactile receptors located deep in the skin respond to the movement of joints? Raffinase and organs. What class of molecules includes endorphins and enkephalins? Opiates. Why is insensitivity to pain dangerous? prevents detection of discomfort that may lead to serious injury. What measure do we use to describe levels of sound? Decibels. Name the three ossicles: hammer, anvil, and strip. What fluid-filled structure in the inner ear contains the basilar membrane? Cochlea. What areas within the auditory cortex act to integrate or coordinate auditory information with signals from other sensory modalities? Association. What irritating condition is described as ringing in the ears? Tinnitus. Name the two major classes of photoreceptors: rods and cones. What term refers to the wavelength of light that a visual stimulus produces? Hue. What condition results in a person ignoring one side of their visual field? Hemi-neglect. What term is used to describe how we determine the distance of objects from us and their spatial relationship with one another? Depth perception. What disorder is characterized by the inability to naturally develop coordinated movement of both eyes? Strabismus. Top-down processing contributes to which three types of perceptual constancy? Top-down processing contributes to color constancy, shape constancy, and size constancy.